Winds from the Atlantic, 1947 to 1950. The Lighthouse begins. A lost love. In 1947, when the winds from the Atlantic swept across the Maine coastline, heavy with salt and a haunting solitude, Samuel Arden stepped off the night train in the town of Wiscasset. He carried a faded canvas bag and a pair of sorrowful eyes. He hadn't come to begin anew, but to escape. After brutal years of war in France, where he left behind a part of his body and many pieces of his memory, returning to New York only deepened the hollow ache within him. For Eleanor, the only woman he had ever loved, was no longer waiting. Her red hair and ash-gray eyes had once been the only light in his darkest days. But when Samuel returned, she was gone, taking with her the world he used to know. Assigned to serve as the lighthouse keeper at Cape Wrath, a remote beacon perched precariously on a cliffside overlooking the sea, Samuel almost willingly chose exile. The path leading to the lighthouse was as rough and treacherous as his soul felt then. There was only the wind, the pounding waves, and Rusty, an old dog and the last companion of the previous keeper. In those early days, Samuel lived a slow and solitary rhythm, polishing the lantern glass, logging the weather, maintaining the machinery, and each evening, lighting the beacon that spun its way through the endless dark. It was a repetitive task, but within that monotony he found a fragile kind of peace. At night he sat by the window, writing letters he would never send, to Eleanor, to the past, to a pain he couldn't yet name. He wrote of the Black Sea, of the silent light circling through the mist, and of what it felt like to stand alone in the night and not feel entirely lost. Each word was a thread holding the human part of him from drifting too far into the ocean of memory. Then, in the winter of 1949, a violent storm severed all contact with the mainland. Cape Wrath was swallowed by a furious sky. For days without light, Samuel fought the storm alone, trying to bring the system back online to keep the beacon from going out. He was slightly injured in a fall, but when the light finally surged back to life, piercing the thick black clouds, he collapsed and wept, not just from pain but because, for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. After the storm, Samuel no longer wrote to Eleanor. Instead, he recorded the shifting moods of nature, the changing sound of the wind with the seasons, the color of the sky before a thunderstorm. Eleanor was no longer a wound. She was a memory, an old breeze brushing across the stones before vanishing into the sea. And though his heart had once shattered, Samuel's hands still lit the beacon each night, no longer for someone who might return, but because he understood that the light, quiet and steadfast, was the only thing left he could truly believe in. Amid the crash of waves and the quiet passage of time, Samuel Arden, the lighthouse keeper of Cape Wrath, no longer fled from sorrow. He lived with it, as he lived with the wind from the sea. The letters never sent, 1950 to 1960, a life in solitude and memory. A voice in the wind. 10 years after first arriving at Cape Wrath, Samuel Arden still lived in the lighthouse. Through winters of piercing white snow and summers blurred with salty gray mist, his life resembled a pendulum clock hanging on a stone wall, slow, steady, and seemingly never out of rhythm. Each morning, he woke to the sound of wind sweeping against the glass, brewed a pot of black coffee, recorded the weather in careful handwriting, and spent most of his day inspecting equipment, maintaining the light. And when evening fell, he would sit alone at an old wooden desk to write. Letters that would never be sent. Letters to Eleanor. Letters to his younger self. Letters to long-departed parents. To a friend who never returned from war. Letters with no names, no envelopes, no stamps. Just neat handwriting on yellowed paper, tucked into an old leather notebook hidden deep beneath a chest. It was Samuel's only way of speaking to the world, while the world had all but forgotten him. In the long silence that stretched across the seasons, memory became Samuel's closest companion. Persistent, gentle, and sometimes cruel. He remembered Eleanor the way one recalls a song that once made the heart stutter, even if the lyrics had faded. On still nights, when the sea's rhythm slowed to a heartbeat, he would sit by the window and imagine he heard her voice carried on the wind. A quiet call, a vague melody, a whisper meant only for him. In those moments, he closed his eyes not to push the illusion away, but to hold onto it a little longer. That voice, maybe Eleanor's, maybe his own from long ago, was the only sound that could still make his heart stir. Gradually, he began recording not just what could be seen, but what could only be felt. A strange pull in the southwestern wind, a recurring dream of an old Vermont field, or the silhouette of a man standing in the fog, uncertain whether real or imagined. In these notes, the lighthouse was no longer a refuge. It had become part of his body, another breath in a long, quiet existence. Rusty, his loyal old dog, died on a February night in 1955. Samuel buried him beneath the fir tree behind the keeper's house, where each autumn the leaves fell golden like tiny flames. After that, solitude was no longer just a condition. It was a space he lived in, something that sustained him and slowly wore him down. But he didn't resist it. Instead, Samuel began to live more deeply in every moment. The sudden shift of wind before the rain, the pale red light of the beacon cutting through thick fog, the scent of rust rising from damp railings. In 1958, a small event broke the pattern. A little girl, maybe 10 years old, lost from a tour group, knocked on the lighthouse door in the middle of a rainy afternoon. Samuel let her in, made her a cup of cocoa, and sat her by the coal stove glowing red. They didn't speak much, just a few quiet questions and nods, but her eyes, wide with fear and curiosity, made Samuel realize something he hadn't thought of in years. It had been a long time since he'd looked into another person's eyes. When her parents arrived, grateful and frantic, and took her away, Samuel stood at the door for a long time, watching the small footprints in the wet earth until the rain washed them away. After that day, the voice in the wind grew clearer, no longer just Eleanor or echoes of the past, but a gentle reminder that even in solitude, he was still part of the world, like the silent light of the beacon, turning steadily, whether or not anyone was watching. The letters continued to be written, like a ritual to preserve memory, to hold onto himself, and to keep alive the fading voice carried by the wind. Light in the Fog, 1960 to 1965. Strange phenomena around the island. The presence of Margot. In the early 1960s, as Samuel Arden entered his 50s, something quietly shifted around Cape Wrath. It wasn't the storms growing fiercer or the waves rising higher, but the atmosphere itself, as if the thick fog had begun to carry something else within it. Fishermen from a town over 30 miles to the south began whispering about a flickering light at the northern tip. A strange glow, not from the lighthouse, that appeared in the dead of night and vanished before anyone could get a good look. But Samuel, living at the heart of it all, didn't need rumors. He saw it with his own eyes. First, it was a faint yellow glimmer moving across the pine ridge behind the lighthouse, a place no one ever went, given the treacherous terrain. Some nights, the light moved as if someone were carrying a lantern through the fog. Steady, deliberate, and completely silent. Samuel checked the generators, the lamp lens, even began to doubt his own vision. But everything was fine, and the light, almost playfully, kept returning. Not every night, but often enough that he had to accept it as part of his reality. Then one March evening in 1961, with thick fog rolling over the cliffs, he saw a figure, standing still on the western ledge. A tall, slender silhouette, long hair pulled by the wind like strands of silver thread. She faced away from him, unmoving, like a statue. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the strange, fleeting feeling that he was no longer alone. But when he stepped outside, lantern in hand, she was gone, dispersed into the sea wind like smoke. After that night, the figure of the woman in the fog began to appear more often, sometimes on the rocky shore, sometimes along the trail to the small cove, or faintly reflected in the upper windows of the lighthouse. On some nights, Samuel stayed awake until morning, sitting by the window, pen in hand but never writing a word, watching every shift in shadow, hoping to see her once more. And then, without reason or thought, he called out, "Margot?" The name came to him like a breath, unbidden, unfiltered, as if it had always been with him, waiting to be spoken. When he called it, the wind stopped. The room seemed to freeze, save for the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. From that night on, Margot became the name he whispered in dreams, wrote in his journal, and spoke aloud when he was alone with the wind. Not Eleanor, his first love, now left behind in memory. Margot was something else, something more elusive, deeper, like a part of the darkness he had never dared to enter. Samuel began writing strange passages in his notebook, almost like conversations with Margot, or perhaps with himself through her form. He recorded the nameless light in the pines, the footprints on damp ground that vanished by morning, the distant calling from beneath the cliffs during his night rounds. One night, he smelled lavender in a room that had never held flowers. Another night, the slipcover on the armchair stirred slightly, as if someone had brushed past. In the winter of 1963, the fog grew so thick that even the beacon could barely cut through it. One such night, while climbing the tower to clean the lens, he saw her, more clearly than ever before. She stood outside the round window, balanced on the edge of the railing, her hair soaked, her eyes meeting his through the fogged glass. Not afraid, not sorrowful, just eyes that felt familiar, as if he'd known them all his life. Her hand lifted and touched the window, and he mirrored the gesture with his own. A pane of glass and endless years separated them, but in that moment the world seemed to stop. Then she was gone, not vanished into mist, just simply no longer there, as if she'd never been. From that night on, Samuel stopped writing letters to Eleanor. His journal entries now began with, "Margot, tonight the wind changed," or "Margot, I saw you standing in the light." He didn't know who she was, a real person, a spirit, or a forgotten shard of his own mind, but he no longer felt the same kind of solitude. Her presence, faint as fog, made him believe something deeper was out there, beyond the mist, beyond the life he thought he fully understood. Margot never spoke, never left a trace, but from 1960 to 1965, she was the other light in the lighthouse keeper's life. A light not from the beacon, but from a place much deeper, a place he had never named until the wind carried it to him in the night. The amber-tinted night, 1965 to 1970 Cold War, espionage and secrets hidden in stone. Starting in 1965, Samuel Arden began to notice unusual changes, not just in the weather, but in the people who passed by the lighthouse. Cape Wrath, long remote and nearly forgotten by the world, suddenly became the destination of strange, unmarked vessels. These weren't trading ships or fishing boats, but small, nameless craft that slipped silently into the rocky cove and left without a word. On certain nights, Samuel would hear the hum of engines skimming across the water. No lights, no horns, just a faint trail in the moonlit waves, leaving behind the uneasy feeling that darkness was seeping into the very cracks of this land. The world beyond was caught in the throes of the Cold War. He still heard the news crackling from his small radio, the BBC voice cutting through the howling wind. Berlin, Cuba, secret agents, missiles, cold, metallic words, far removed from his life beside the lighthouse. But one autumn day, that distant war arrived at his doorstep in the form of a stranger. The man came at twilight, under an amber sky, a strange hue Samuel had never seen before. Not quite gold, not quite orange, but a light that looked as though it had passed through an old pane of dusty, time-worn glass. The stranger wore a long coat and a fedora, and spoke English with a hard-to-place Eastern European accent. He introduced himself as a marine engineer, claiming to be studying tides and currents along Scotland's northern coast. But there was something in his gaze, cold, calculating, that made Samuel wary. He allowed the man to stay one night in the lower room, but remained awake the entire night, listening to the soft creak of his footsteps moving around the lighthouse. That night, the light returned to the western cliffs. Not the soft, dreamlike glow of Margot from years past, but a sharp beam of a flashlight, sweeping across the rocks with precision, as if searching for something. Samuel watched through his binoculars, heart pounding. By morning, the man was gone, no farewell, no explanation. All that remained was a faint boot print in the damp earth and a scrap of paper with a string of strange numbers, caught in the step by the wind. From then on, the lighthouse became the target of more strange visits. Once, it was two men in British naval uniforms claiming to be inspecting electrical equipment. Another time, a woman in a leather coat arrived with an old camera, calling herself a journalist, yet asking far too many questions about the rock formations around the Cape. Samuel, quiet and weathered, didn't ask questions or interfere, but he recorded everything in his notebook. The times the boats came, the wind's direction, the frequency of radio interference. And then, he found something truly strange. after a heavy storm, while checking the cliffs, he discovered a narrow crack behind a patch of moss. Inside it, a deep hollow in the stone where a small, rusted metal box had been hidden. Inside the box were a map of the region, several aerial photographs, a strip of film negative, and a Soviet wristwatch. All of it sealed in red wax, the emblem of a world far beyond his reach. Samuel didn't report it to the authorities. Instead, he hid the box in a crag on the eastern side, where sunlight only touched it at the precise hour of dawn. From that day on, whenever the sky turned amber at dusk, he felt that he was no longer just a lighthouse keeper, but the guardian of a secret larger than himself, larger than the lighthouse. A secret buried in stone, tucked between the folds of fog and layered across eras. He didn't know whether what he found was a weapon of war or simply a leftover echo of some long-dead game of espionage. But he knew one thing: in the wrong hands, it could change history. In those final years of the decade, Samuel grew older, slower. But each time he saw the sky blush amber with that strange light, he would climb to the top of the lighthouse, old binoculars in hand, and gaze toward the western rocks. Margot was gone, Eleanor too, but he knew the darkness was still moving, and beneath the sweeping beam of the lantern, through the fog and sea wind, he continued to keep watch, not only over the lighthouse, but over all the things that had never been spoken. The boy from Boothbay Harbor, 1970 to 1975, a lost child who changed Elijah's life. One summer morning in 1970, as the sea around Cape Wrath lay still and dark like a sheet of deep blue glass, Elijah, the aging lighthouse keeper who had lived alone for years after the time of Samuel Arden, spotted a small wooden rowboat drifting toward the rocky shore. Inside was a thin boy, hair tangled, bright eyes wide open, hands trembling as they clutched a wooden medallion hanging around his neck, faintly etched with the words, Boothbay Harbor. There were no missing child reports from the mainland, no one searching, and so the boy Tom stayed. One night became a week became 5 years, and Elijah found his once quiet, cold world unexpectedly stirred by the soft footsteps, endless questions, and innocent curiosity of a boy who liked to climb the tower, breathe fog onto the lens glass, collect seashells, and imagine they were strange relics drifting in from faraway oceans. Elijah, long unused to anyone's presence, gradually learned to share. He taught Tom how to log weather patterns, how to operate the beacon light, how to listen for radio signals among the silence broken only by wind and waves. On long nights, they told each other stories of the sea, of ghosts, of light, and the secrets carved into stone by generations long gone. Tom didn't just learn. He brought laughter, vitality, and a quiet, profound affection Elijah never thought he'd feel again. Like having a grandson born not by blood, but by the sea's wild fate. Then, one winter day in 1975, a mother from Boothbay Harbor arrived. She had never given up hope, and now, through the eyes of a boy who had grown wiser but still sparkled with mischief, she recognized her long-lost son. Elijah watched him go without words, without tears, just the beam of the lighthouse turning steadily, as it always had. The boy stepped onto the boat, looked back, and promised to return. And in that promise, Elijah heard the very thing he had yearned for all his life. That even though people come and go, Even though waves crash and wash over stone, something can truly stay. From that day on, whenever Elijah stood atop the lighthouse and looked southward, he no longer watched only for winds or passing ships. He listened, too, for a part of memory that had become hope. The hope of a lighthouse keeper who once believed his story was finished, until the boy from Boothbay Harbor arrived and left behind a light in his heart, as steady and true as the beacon in the fog. Lighthouses Don't Lie, 1975 to 1980, The Mystery of the Keeper Before Elijah. When the first cold winds of autumn 1975 swept down from the north, carrying the scent of seaweed and the endless murmuring of the ocean, Elijah once again felt something was off at Cape Wrath. After sending young Tom back to Boothbay, the familiar quiet no longer brought comfort. Instead, it grew dense and heavy, like something long buried in the island's ancient past had begun to stir. From the day he first arrived to take over the lighthouse, Elijah had occasionally heard vague whispers of the name Jonathan Muir, the keeper before Samuel Arden. His name existed only in technical logs, a brief note in the operation book, and an old rumor that he vanished in the winter of 1946. No body, no burial, no search. The beacon kept turning, and the lighthouse door was found slightly ajar the morning after a storm. But it wasn't until 1976, when a large slab of stone collapsed along the eastern cliffside, that Elijah stumbled upon a hidden room sealed behind ancient rock. Inside, a decayed wooden chair, a few charred diary pages, and an old photograph of a tall, gaunt man in a thick wool sweater standing silently before the lighthouse. Behind him stood a younger Samuel Arden, his expression complex, unreadable. Elijah began digging deeper into the old records, dusty papers from the mainland's maritime office, and unsent letters locked away in Samuel's private drawer. In faded handwriting, a single sentence repeated over and over gave Elijah chills. Jonathan never left the island. He knew something. And the lighthouse doesn't lie. Then came the sense of being watched. On fog-heavy nights, when the light barely reached a few yards into the mist, Elijah would hear slow footsteps spiraling up the tower, though he was alone on the island. One night he woke to wind howling, the top floor door blown wide open, and on his desk sat a blank sheet of paper. Scrawled across it, in a shaky hand, second basement. But there was only one basement housing the old generator and fuel drums. There had never been a second, or so everyone believed. Elijah began prying up the stone floor, piece by piece, until he uncovered a narrow, welded steel trapdoor, sealed by hand. Someone, at some point, had clearly wanted whatever was below to never be found. Beneath lay a small, nearly intact room. A desk, notebooks, and a battered Grundig reel-to-reel recorder. Elijah switched it on. From the crackling speaker came a deep, trembling voice. A man recounting what he had seen. "I saw that light, not from the beacon, not from any man. I think Samuel saw it too. But he said if I told anyone, everything would end." The tape cut in and out, ending in the sound of rushing wind and a sharp metallic clang, like something heavy dragged in panic. Elijah stood frozen in the room, heart pounding. Jonathan's death hadn't been an accident, or even a disappearance in the ordinary sense. It was something deeper, darker, a secret that belonged not to governments or war or science, but to this place itself. The lighthouse, the stone, the wind, and the nameless things they held. When Elijah returned upstairs, the old photograph was gone. No one had visited the island since Tom left. No one knew what he'd found. Elijah never told a soul. He simply wrote a single line in the keeper's log: "The lighthouse doesn't lie, but it doesn't protect you from the truth." And for the rest of his years, he lived in the turning light and the tightening dark, not with the loneliness of a watchman, but with the painful awareness of one who knows. Some deaths are not in human hands, and some secrets are meant to stay buried in stone. The Whaleskin Book, 1980 to 1990, a forgotten journal of the supernatural. One afternoon in 1982, while inspecting the foundation behind the lighthouse's engine room after a strong gale, Elijah stumbled upon a narrow crack between two ancient stones. Following the fissure, he discovered a hidden crevice, sealed long ago with lime and overgrown moss. Clearly someone had tried to conceal it. Inside was a wooden chest, carved with waves and the head of a whale, symbols once believed by coastal Mainers to be omens from the sea. Inside the chest, he found a thick book, wrapped in aged silvery gray whale skin. It gave off a strong briny scent, and the rough texture of the cover felt as though the sea itself had clung to it. The cover bore no title, only the image of a lightning-struck lighthouse and a faded Latin inscription: Lux abscondita, the hidden light. Elijah brought the book into the reading room, carefully wiping off each page. It turned out to be a journal, an unorganized patchwork record of supernatural events, compiled from the early 1800s through the 1920s by generations of lighthouse keepers and sailors who had once taken shelter at Cape Wrath. Its entries were fragmented, like shards of memory. Descriptions of blue lights hovering above the water, strange creatures whose sounds resembled human singing, silhouettes passing behind the lighthouse lens on nights when no visitors had come ashore, and ships that vanished while crossing the strait in June, only to drift back years later, rotted and empty, as if time aboard had stopped completely. One of the most haunting pages recounted the testimony of a sailor in 1871, who claimed he'd heard a woman's voice singing in the fog, and seen a man in a keeper's coat, standing in the middle of the sea, holding a lantern burning blue, guiding our ship straight into the rocks. The deeper Elijah read, the more unsettled he became. Some of the events described matched his own experiences with eerie precision. The tolling of bells in windless silence, flickering lights that defied explanation, recurring dreams of a woman standing outside the glass. What he had once dismissed as imagination had already been recorded, by hands shaking with fear, in words torn between sleep and wakefulness. One passage even mapped the exact location of the hidden passage beneath the basement, the very one where Elijah had found Jonathan Muir's recorder in 1976. It became clear he wasn't just part of the story, he was its last living heir. A final link in a chain of memory stretching back centuries, written in salt, sweat, and secrets no one dared to name aloud. The Whaleskin Book wasn't just a record, it was a door, a portal into a parallel reality, where Cape Wrath was more than just a lighthouse. It was a threshold between light and shadow, science and myth, a restless past and a trembling present. Elijah locked it away in a cabinet, but once a year, on the first foggy night of autumn, he would take it out and turn its pages again. not to understand, but to remember. Some truths he knew weren't meant to be explained, only respected and kept safe in silence. And the lighthouse, in its endless turning, seemed to understand that better than anyone. Margot and the Day Without Sun, 1990 to 2000. The truth about Margot is revealed. As the 20th century came to a close and the world rushed headlong into the digital age, life at Cape Wrath remained untouched, as if time had slowed to a quiet crawl. Elijah still lived in solitude among stone, wind, and the endless rotation of the lighthouse beam. Over 30 years had passed since he first saw the silhouette of Margot emerge from the autumn fog, yet the image had never faded from his memory. Each year, on the same day, the Day Without Sun, when fog blanketed the island, the sea lay eerily still, and no birds passed over the tower, Elijah would see her again. Long hair flowing, pale blue eyes, and a quiet smile like a promise never spoken. He had never understood why she came, or why she appeared only for a moment before fading. Until 1994, when he discovered an old letter tucked into a hidden wooden compartment behind a false wall in the pantry. It was handwritten, signed Margot S. Muir, and addressed to Samuel Arden, dated winter 1946. In the letter, Margot spoke of the loneliness of a young woman living in Boothbay, once Samuel's close friend and secret love. They had grown up together, sharing dreams and whispered vows, until the war took Samuel to Cape Wrath. Margot had made a desperate journey to the island one stormy night in a rented skiff, hoping to see him one last time before leaving for France with her family. But Samuel never came down to meet her. He remained in the lantern room, writing in his logbook, "If she sees the light, she'll understand." Margot waited at the foot of the lighthouse all night, shivering in the cold, not knowing what the light was meant to say, only that the man she loved never appeared. By morning, her skiff was found drifting along the western rocks. Margot was never seen again. Authorities believed she'd been swept away by waves or lost in the fog, but no body was ever found. No explanation ever given. Reading the letter, Elijah felt a swell of sorrow rise in his chest, because all the strange occurrences he'd witnessed on the island, all the glimpses of Margot in the fog, all the nights when the wind wailed like a voice calling, were not mere illusions, but fragments of a soul still bound to the island. Margot had not vanished. She had been forgotten, abandoned by the rotating beam of light at the one moment she needed to be seen. And somehow the island had kept her there, not to haunt but to wait for someone patient enough to uncover the truth. On the anniversary of her death, under the fog-choked sky of a sunless day, Elijah carried the letter to the top of the lighthouse and read it aloud. As he reached the final lines, "If you don't come down, I will still forgive you, but please, don't let the light be the only answer." The still air stirred. The fog began to lift. In a fleeting moment, Elijah saw her, clearer than ever, standing in the light's glow, eyes meeting his, not angry, not resentful, just the gentle sadness of someone who had waited long enough. And then she was gone. From that year onward, on the Day Without Sun, the fog no longer lingered into the afternoon. The lighthouse no longer echoed with phantom footsteps. Elijah knew Margot had finally left the island. She was no longer a ghost in the mist, but a memory returned to the light, and he, the keeper who had spent his life guiding ships, had, for the first time, brought light to a wandering soul. The light that never goes out. 2000 to 2020. Elijah grows old, passes on the flame. The island faces destruction. As the 21st century began, Cape Wrath was no longer the forgotten speck on nautical charts it had once been. Satellites, GPS systems, and automated beacons had rendered most lighthouses along America's eastern seaboard obsolete, silent relics amid wind and wave. But the light at Cape Wrath still burned, not because of government mandate, but because of the weathered hands of Elijah Harrow, the last lighthouse keeper, and perhaps the last man who still believed that light had a soul. By then, Elijah was in his 80s. His back was hunched, his vision dimming, and he could no longer climb the tower's 132 steps without stopping 3 times to rest. Yet each night he tried. The light, rotating like the heartbeat of the island, had been part of his life for over half a century. He knew he wasn't just performing a duty. He was guarding a memory of all the souls that had passed through this place, all the unnamed stories, the secrets lost in fog that no one had ever written down. In 2007, a real estate firm from Boston unveiled plans to redevelop Cape Wrath into a luxury resort, complete with a helipad, glass villas overlooking the ocean, and a museum honoring the quaint history of lighthouse keeping. They called the lighthouse a promising abandoned asset, and referred to Elijah, a solitary old man with no internet, as a humanitarian issue to be resolved. The news reached Elijah through an electric technician doing maintenance. Elijah said nothing. He simply returned to his room, opened an old wooden cabinet, and took out a bundle of tied-up letters, a worn leather journal, and a black and white photo of himself as a young man standing beside the beacon. He knew his time was running short, and that the light could no longer survive through trembling hands alone. In the winter of 2010, on a night when the fog hung thick like jelly, a small boat from Booth Bay landed on the island. Its oarsman was a man named Silas, the same boy who had once wandered here and spent a long summer with Elijah back in the 70s. Silas had become a quiet man, with the eyes of someone who had traveled far and returned searching for something lost. Elijah invited him to stay for a week. Then 2. Slowly he passed down everything he knew: how to read the sea by the color of the waves, how to relight the beacon in thick fog, how to read the weather through the salt in the air, and more than anything, how to listen to the island, as if it whispered only to those patient enough to hear. By 2015, the demolition plans neared final approval. A public meeting was held in Booth Bay, Elijah's first time leaving the island in decades. His voice was raspy and slow, but every word struck like iron into wood. He didn't speak of history. He didn't quote laws. He told a story of Margot, of Samuel, of green lights drifting on the sea, and of a keeper who had kept the light burning not out of duty, but because he believed some things, if allowed to go dark, would take part of the world's soul with them. The story spread. The media came. Locals signed petitions. And, strangely enough, by 2017, the investment firm quietly withdrew. No explanation was ever given. Cape Wrath was turned over to an independent preservation trust, and Silas was named the new lighthouse keeper. Elijah passed away on a March night in 2019, under a pale moon that cast a silent halo over the lantern tower. Silas found him seated at the window on the top floor, the whaleskin book open, his hand resting on the wind map. He was buried at the base of the lighthouse, beside where Samuel once lay, among rock, moss, and the sound of waves, forever part of the island. Since that day, the Cape Wrath light has never stopped turning. In an age of automation and silence, this place still has a night watchman, still has a handmade light, still carries a tradition that survived being forgotten. Because some lights never go out. Not because of electricity, but because someone still believes. The wind still blows through the lighthouse keeper's heart. 2020. A final testament. A new generation. The last secret. As the third decade of the 21st century began, Cape Wrath was no longer just a strange name found on old nautical maps or whispered about in dusklit stories. It had become a symbol, not of desolation, but of endurance, of a light that refused to bow to darkness, and of the people who spent their lives ensuring that one small flame never died. And still, the wind blew, cold as blades off the Atlantic, through the lantern tower, through wooden doors, and through the heart of the lighthouse keeper. Silas, the boy who once stumbled onto the island, now bore the weight of the legacy Elijah had passed down. He was not born of the island's rock and sea, but his heart beat in time with it. Each day, he recorded the wind's temperature, the humidity, the frequency of the beacon's pulse. Each night, he listened to the creak of old wood, the flutter of nocturnal birds, and sometimes, the eerie echo of footsteps circling the tower. One day, while checking the supply room in the rear of the lighthouse, Silas found a tin box tucked behind a shelf. Inside was a reel-to-reel tape labeled in Elijah's handwriting, "Play only when the wind changes direction." On the tape, Elijah's voice, old and breathy, didn't speak of Margot or Samuel, or the strange lights seen drifting over the water. Instead, he told a story of nearly dying in his sleep during the winter of 1963. When the stove went out, water froze solid in his cup, and wind howled through the cracks like it meant to carry him away. And in that hazy space between life and death, he heard a whisper in the voice of the sea. "If you keep the flame, the island will stay alive." From that moment, Elijah believed Cape Wrath was sentient. Not in the haunted sense, but as a living being that knew who loved it, who betrayed it, and who merely passed through. At the end of the recording was a message, a final instruction. "Silas, if you're hearing this, the wind has shifted, and when the wind shifts, the island will bring its last secret into the light." That secret didn't come in an old book or a moldy letter. It came in a crack in the cliffs, where a chunk of rock had fallen away after the first storm of 2022. While inspecting the damage, Silas found a hollow in the stone, etched with unfamiliar symbols, and a rusted iron chest sealed with a rotating dial mechanism that resembled an astronomical clock. Drawing on decades of knowledge passed down from Elijah, Silas realized this was not of the modern age. It was likely left behind by the first lighthouse keeper in the 1800s. When he opened it, inside was a hand-drawn map in charcoal ink, a journal written in archaic English, and a small brass instrument, something like a magnetic field detector. The journal chronicled extreme weather events that coincided with the years people had vanished from the island. But it was one faded line that made Silas stand still for hours beside the beacon. Every keeper carries a piece of the dark, but only when they understand the light can they know why the wind still blows through their heart. Silas never revealed the discovery to the media. Instead, he copied the journal entries by hand into his own diary and returned the iron chest to the hollow, sealing it once more with the island's own stones. He understood then, the final secret wasn't something to expose, but something to preserve, like a seed waiting for the right season. And the next generation, marine biology students, documentary filmmakers, or even the child who wandered wide-eyed into the Lighthouse Museum, was beginning to arrive. They didn't tend the light like Elijah, didn't hear the wind as Silas did, but there was something in their eyes that felt familiar. A belief that there are still places in this world where people live not just to survive, but to protect something greater than themselves. And when night falls over the cold sea, the light of Cape Wrath still turns slowly, like the heartbeat of an island that never sleeps. The wind still blows, and someone somewhere still hears it pass through their heart.
you.